I believe that we were all put on this earth to accomplish a certain number of things, and I'm now so far behind I can never die. Well, I am so far behind. I don't know about the never die stuff, but I always think of my mother when I was a little girl during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States, and we lived in Massachusetts, so we were on the East Coast, and kids on the East Coast, even little kids like me, were much more conscious of the Cuban Missile Crisis because we were going to go first, we figured. And I was really high-strung about it. And one night, my mother was putting me to bed, and I said, "Mom, do you think it's going to happen? Do you think, it's going to be like, World War III?" And my mother said, "Forget about it, Butchka." We were Italian and Polish. She said, "Forget about it, Butchka. There's no way you're going to get out of going to school tomorrow." And I got to go to work. So, and that's what I've always thought. People have asked me, "Do you think this is it?" And I said, yeah, nothing's going to get us out of going to work tomorrow.
Science fiction author Pat Cadigan joins Jon and Scoop from London for this episode of the Plutopia Podcast. She talks about her battle with cancer, the stratification of fantasy and sci-fi, January 6th and the president who shall not be named, her novelization of William Gibson's unproduced script for Alien 3, and much more.
Welcome to the Plutopia News Network podcast. In our latest episode today, Scoop Sweeney and I, John Lebkowski, will be joined by our guest Pat Cadigan, joining us from the United Kingdom. Pat is an esteemed science fiction author. She's one of the original contributors to the cyberpunk subgenre, and she's sometimes been referred to as the Queen of Cyberpunk. Some references say that she writes fiction that deals with the interaction between the human mind and technology, certainly an apt description of cyberpunk and also a lot of other science fiction. She's one of my favorite science fiction authors, and we're happy to have her on board today. The first thing that we want to ask is about just kind of what it's been like. I know you moved to the UK a long time ago.
Yeah.
What's it like being an American in the UK?
Well, actually, I'm a recovering American, as I tell people. But I really have liked it here, a lot. In the last few years, what with, David Cameron and then Theresa May, and then, to add insult to injury, Boris Johnson, it's been, and then, Brexit, and Fexit, as we say. But I've really been quite comfortable and very much at home here. Well, although I have to say, I do live in London, so, I think that's a factor. There are people in the UK, and then there's London. And the first time I ever went to London, I felt like I was coming home. And it reminded me a lot of Boston. But London really has, the one thing you notice when you get into London is that there's no grid pattern to the roads. So you might take a side street thinking that, that's kind of a shortcut to this other street over here, and you'll end up somewhere else entirely, For a long time, streets came and went for me. Then there were places that I could only get to if I got lost first. And then, then I'd be there.
That sounds adventurous.
Oh, it is. It is. But I love the city, and it's been so kind of sad, not to be able to get out into it.
Yeah, I assume you've been sheltering in place like the rest of us. Yeah, that gets old after a while.
Well, it does, but also, when you have cancer, it complicates any given situation, a million times more than it would be. So I've had to shelter more. I've had to be extremely careful about going out. Up until now, I really couldn't use public transportation safely. But I just got my second vaccination jab, and it should be by this time next week. It should be about ripe, so to speak, and I'll be able to go out much more safely than before. Although I will be wearing, a mask. I think I'd be wearing a mask anyway, just because of the fact that I really need to see a dentist.
Well, we know somebody who was having chemo for cancer and actually caught COVID in the midst of that, and she seemed to recover okay. So we were pretty worried, but it seemed to go okay.
Oh yeah, chemo is. Well,
yeah, I know it's terrible.
The whole sheltering thing has been like the second week of chemo. It's just the second week of chemo that never ever ends. And that's when you're, the week after you've had a round of chemo, that's when your resistance to disease nosedives, and you have to be very careful about not going out, being very careful what you eat, and washing your hands all the time, and just all kinds of stuff. And
it's really amazing.
I haven't had to maintain such a high level of hygiene.
What's really amazing to me is that I know that they assigned you like a 2016 expiration date at one point.
Yeah.
And you just refused to expire. I saw your quote where you said, "Heaven doesn't want me and hell's afraid I'll take over."
Yeah, and I say that a lot. And also, I believe that we were all put on this earth to accomplish a certain number of things, and I'm now so far behind I can never die. Well, I am so far behind. I don't know about the never die stuff, but I always think of my mother when I was a little girl during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States. And we lived in Massachusetts, so we were on the East Coast. And kids on the East Coast, even little kids like me, were much more conscious of the Cuban Missile Crisis because we were going to go first, we figured. And I was really high-strung about it. And one night, my mother was putting me to bed. And I said, "Mom, do you think it's going to happen? Do you think, it's going to be like, World War III?" And my mother said, "Forget about it, Puchka." We were Italian and Polish. She said, "Forget about it, Puchka. There's no way you're going to get out of going to school tomorrow." And I got to go to work. So, and that's what I've always thought. People have asked me, "Do you think this is it?" And I said, "Yeah, nothing's going to get us out of going to work tomorrow."
Well, if the bombs are falling, you can always hide under your desk at school. So you mentioned when you were young, when you were a little girl, are you one of these people who early on started writing stories?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. As soon as I started writing stories, and then as soon as I found out that books and stories came out of other people who wrote them, I knew that's what I was going to be. That was me. My mother gave me her old Underwood typewriter, and I kind of learned to type on that. And I have such finger strength that I could kill you with an index finger. It's like legendary Bruce Lee 1-inch punch. But it really, you had to pound those keys in order to get them to type. And now I'm real spoiled.
Because computers are relatively light touch.
Oh, yeah.
I was reading your Wikipedia entry, and I was fascinated by your Venusian twins back in the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
And could you clarify that? Because it sounded like something I would have been involved in at the same time.
Well, somewhere online, the Kitchen Sisters have the thing that was built around. They had sent out calls for girls who lived fantasy lives. And my best friend Rosemary and I had lived this entire fantasy life that we were from Venus. This was long before they decided women were from Venus and men were from Mars and all of that. And we were from Venus, and we were twins. We were actually twins on Venus, but we'd been sent to two different families on Earth. And all of the Beatles. We got mad into the Beatles. We were madly in love with the Beatles, and so we weren't just fans of the Beatles. We became the Beatles. Like we were the stunt Beatles, and we became the Beatles, and we made the music, and then the regular Beatles were very puzzled by this, but we had a secret relationship with them where, they understood that we were from Venus, and so of course we were superior forms of life. And I don't ever remember not having a fantasy life. I mean, there were fantasy lives that Rose and I lived as well outside of this one that we had with each other, and I did this all the time. And one day when I was passing my son's room when he was about 4 or 5 years old, and I could hear him talking inside, and I realized he was leading a whole fantasy life, completely separate from, he was living a couple of them. And I thought, well, the tradition goes on. Because I'd never told him about it, and I doubt he would have understood, being, like 3 or 4 years old. So it's something that a lot of kids do, and when they grow up, they kind of forget about it. But of course, I never did because being a writer, I needed a lot of grist for my mill.
You mean you never grew up, or you never forgot about it?
Probably both. Probably both. It's yeah, definitely both.
I've always felt growing up would be hazardous to my health.
Well, occasionally I can adult, and I adult pretty well when I do it. But if I don't have to, I don't.
So,
yeah.
When did you discover science fiction? What do you remember the first science fiction that you read, and what attracted you to it?
Well, I just remember, I don't really remember the first science fiction that I read. I just remember that I was very interested in science. And when I saw anything related to science, I would investigate it. And the first science fiction that I read was probably in the Children's Public Library at, in my hometown in Fitchburg. And that's where I read an awful lot of books. And I remember my mother was kind of curious about what I was reading and whether it was any good, or whether it was something good for me or it was junk. And she told me that she had looked through some of my science fiction books, and I had picked up, some righteous science fiction. I read Asimov, and I remember reading A Gun's a Dinosaur by Sprague de Camp, and of course Heinlein, loads and loads of Heinlein. And my mother said she decided that was okay because it was very intelligent. It seemed very intelligent. And I'd gotten my love of reading from my mother. The first thing we ever did when we were in a new place was we went out and we got our library cards. And she would always take me to the library. And it wasn't long before she was checking books out of the adult library for me. And what struck me later on, in those days, science fiction, fantasy, and horror were not as stratified as they are now. And so I'd go to the science fiction shelf, and it would all be there. It's like the Fellowship of the Ring with a little atomic symbol on the binding, because it was science fiction. It's all science fiction. And it was this way for a lot of the writers, too. Robert Bloch, who was a good friend from, the late 70s, early in 1980, until he passed away. He considered himself a science fiction writer and a science fiction fan to the day he died. He was a lovely, lovely man. Wrote some horrendous, suspense thrillers like Psycho and things like that. And I remember he wrote this afterword to a story, or maybe it was part of an article where he was talking about and he was writing Psycho. And at one point in Psycho, I think it was Psycho, his protagonist had a fantasy about going up on top of a high building with a high-powered rifle and picking people off. And this was before the incident in Texas at the University of Austin. This is long before it. And the publisher, the editor, made it take it out because it was just too sadistic.
You know, you mentioned sort of how that stratification of science fiction and horror. I think one thing that really seemed weird to me when I started actually going to cons and hanging out with other science fiction fans was how much it was about fantasy, and how few hard science fiction fans and writers I would run across in some of those contexts.
Well, one of my favorite questions to ask people is, so what is the Martian Chronicles? Is it science fiction or is it fantasy?
I'd say it has elements of both, but it leans to science fiction.
It does lean to science fiction because it leans to, I think, what Bradbury knew of, Mars and space travel at that time. And it's still, for me, it is stubbornly science fiction, even though, it's completely, it isn't anything like what we know about Mars. And, but that's okay with me, And I'd like to see I know that people like to get what they want to get, and they don't want to have to work too hard to find it. So, in one way, categorization is good, but in the other, you can categorize all the life out of something until you have things that won't even get on the shelf because the marketing department doesn't know where to put it or who to sell it to.
Yeah, that's actually that's a huge consideration when you're writing to support yourself. Mm-hmm. Is that you have to write something that will sell, and it's just a fact of life. If they can't get it into a clear category, it's going to be hard to sell. Have you encountered that very much in your writing and your books? Have you had books that were hard to categorize, therefore hard to sell?
No, not really. Not the books, because all my books have been, solidly science fiction. And my shorter fiction has been, I write a lot of short fiction for Ellen, who is the queen of horror, Ellen Datlow. And when Tappan King was editing the Twilight Zone magazine, the late lamented Twilight Zone magazine, I wrote some stuff that was kind of loose and runny, as to category, and I enjoy doing that. But I've never had the problem. The thing that I had was with my novel Tea from an Empty Cup. I had wanted to originally call it Bunraku, which is Japanese puppet theater, and I liked the idea, but of all the editors I knew, only my editor didn't know what it was. And I'd tell people that, I wanted to call it Bunraku, and they'd say, Japanese puppet theater. But my editor felt it was far too obscure, so I'd have to think of another title. And actually, this was sort of the supervising editor for my editor. And my editor, who dealt with me immediately, said, well, how about Tea from an Empty Cup? And at that time, it was the name of sections of the novel. And I thought to myself, maybe not. And then I thought about it some more, and I really liked the idea. So I renamed the sections in the book, and I said, okay, that's the title, Tea from an Empty Cup. And
sounds very Buddhist.
Yeah. And, well, that's what it is. It's a koan. How do you drink tea from an empty cup? And it's probably not pronounced koan, but,
I think that's good enough.
Yeah. Close enough.
Koan.
Yeah. Cohen, Goldberg, whatever. And we're a mixture of Jewish, Polish, and Italian in my family. She came back to me the next day and she said, well, my boss says that we're going to have to think of another title because she doesn't care for it. She doesn't think it'll sell. And so I said, look, you are my editor, not your boss. And I'm calling it Tea from an Empty Cup. And that's it. Well, then, it stood for another day. And then the marketing department was very unhappy with me. And they wanted me to change it. And I said, you tell the marketing department that I'm a bitch. And I won't budge. The bitch won't budge. So it came out as Tea from an Empty Cup. And I never knew what had happened until a few years later. I ran into a bookseller. And he no longer had the store. But at the time that the Tea from an Empty Cup came out, he did have the store. And he said, I got the weirdest call from your publisher's marketing department. And I said, do tell. And he said, they called me and they said, what do you think of a book titled Tea from an Empty Cup? And he said, well, who wrote it? And they said, we're not going to tell you that. We just want to know what you think of the title. And he said, I think it's a smashing title. And you could put it on tea bags, and use that to promote it. And I said, what did they say to that? He said, nothing. They thanked me and hung up. And then a little while after that, I ran into Dick Jude, who was at that time the manager of Forbidden Planet in London. And he said, I got the strangest call from your publisher's marketing department. And I said, oh, do tell. And he said, yeah, they called me up and they said, what do you think of a title for a book, if it's Tea from an Empty Cup? And he said, well, I said, who wrote it? And they said, we won't tell you that. We just want to know what you think of the title. And Dick said, well, I think the title is absolutely wonderful. And I think it's a smashing title. And I said, what did they say to that? He said, oh, they thanked me and hung up. And so it was finding out in the end, about the adventures of the title of my book. And normally I'm a pretty cooperative person, but at that time we'd just been through so many titles, and my editor had thought of this title, and she was a very good editor, she was a very good editor, and I thought that if she had chosen that title, it was the correct one, she'd named the book correctly, because she had that eye, the editorial eye. So that's about all I can, that's the closest I've come to having categorical troubles. It's not categorical trouble; it's a title problem. And I've never been real great at titles, and I've also had my problems with endings. So I guess in terms of that, I'm probably pretty typical of a writer.
Your comment to the marketing people, the bitch won't budge, sound like that might be a good title as well.
Yeah, probably my memoirs, The Bitch Won't Budge.
Well, how often does something that you see happening in the so-called real world impact something that you end up writing? Do you find source material out there and real world happenings?
Oh, all the time. Although I couldn't point to anything exactly and tell you, yeah, that came out of that. Except in Synners, the online thing really grew out of my experiences in the early forms of online chat rooms when you had to join a service to get online, and the service you could open what they called a chat room in the service, and a bunch of people would come in and hang out and talk. And at that time, I was on the Delphi service, and all the science fiction fans and writers, a lot of us, got together regularly, twice a week sometimes, just to, bullshit and can I say that? It's okay if I say that?
I think
absolutely.
To, just to tell stories and complain together or, just hang out. And I remember it was one of the most sociable things, and anyone was free to join us, anyone, any kind of writer really. But there were a hardcore of us, and I remember the hardcore were Lawrence Person and Dwight Brown, Mike Resnick and Jack Chalker, believe it or not. There was a guy who called himself Hokusai after the Japanese painter. It was me, Barb Delaplace, a number. Jim Capio, who was, that time he lived in New York. Now he lives in Toronto, and we really had a bond as a group, even if we didn't all see eye to eye on everything. But we were pals, and those of us who would be at a Worldcon would arrange to get together, out of the chat room and in real life. And we got real fond of each other, I think,
Is that was that group kind of similar to Turkey City?
It wasn't. Well, Turkey City was a writer's workshop, wasn't it?
I think so. I mean, I think that they were not so much sociable, but more focused on critiquing each other and going over their story, their stories, their works.
We didn't do any workshopping or anything like that.
They had great parties.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure they did, considering it was in Turkey City. I just got very fond of these people, and I'm still close to a lot of them, Some of them have left the building, Mike's gone, Jack Chalker's gone, Hokusai's gone. But those of us who survive, we still, I was already friends with Lawrence and Dwight, but I became friends with Jim, meeting him in the chat room, and we're still good friends, it's like good friends for life.
It's like chat was an early version of Zoom.
Yeah, it was, except that, of course, there was no sound and no visual, and everybody typed. And I remember my kid and Davy Chalker got friendly on Delphi, and every so often I'd have to give up, my part in the chat room so that my son and Davy Chalker could chat to each other. I think both of them were just, thrilled with the novelty of, talking by typing on a keyboard. Yeah, my kid was the only kid in kindergarten who wanted to bring in his homework typed.
Go ahead.
No, it was I had my kid online very early, and I encouraged him to be online, but I also taught him what you teach kids when they go outside. Don't give strangers your full address and phone number and tell them your parents aren't home. My kid never had any kind of problem online because he knew enough to not to give away key information.
It's good to be smart when you're online, for sure.
Yeah.
And back then, a lot of people really didn't think about that as much, about the possibility to be scammed or have your identity stolen or whatever, but it was already starting to happen in the early days of the internet.
Yeah.
And I think science fiction people were, tended to be early adopters of not just the internet, but I think about prior to the internet, you had bulletin board systems. So you had something like SMOF BBS that Earl Cooley was doing here in Austin. And then you had, and I was an active user of SMOF.
Earl was in the Delphi chat rooms too. I don't know how I forgot Earl, because I just love Earl and I miss him like anything.
Yeah, me too. He was great. We had some interesting times together. And, a lot of interesting stuff was happening on Smoff. Were you on Smoff?
I was on Smoth. I was on Smoth under the pseudonym Joy Boy.
Oh, that was you.
Yeah.
Now I know. Yeah, I was, I can't remember. I think I just used JONL like I use everywhere.
Yeah.
But I know Bruce was Jules Verne, and Mike Godwin was mnemonic. I can't remember what Lewis was. Anyway, there were a lot of people congregated on Smoth and got into lifelong friendships for sure.
Yeah. Yep.
And then there was that Genie thing. Do you remember a lot of science fiction authors were using Genie? I
was on Genie too, but Delphi I had gone to Delphi first, so I kind of imprinted on that like a baby duck. But I was sort of active on Genie, and I was active during the time in Sephwa when the great controversy about having to requalify as a full member came in. And originally you did have to requalify to be a full member of Sephwa. And Isaac Asimov had been teaching in the college level for something like 10 years, and he hadn't written any science fiction, but he had quite a solid body of work, and he didn't qualify for Sephwa. And he said, any organization of science fiction writers that I don't qualify for isn't worth a patter to blow them the hell with, something like that. And Robert Heinlein said, you know what, you're right. So Heinlein worked with another writer named Joan Hunter Hawley to change the laws so that you didn't have to requalify for Sephwa membership, you just had to pay dues. And some people in Sephwa got it into their heads that this was letting in a lot of the riffraff. And one of the things that they were angry about was that Charlie Brown, the late Charlie Brown of Locus, had a full membership in Sephwa when he wasn't a science fiction writer. And I said, no, wait a minute, before you, light your torches and grab your pitchforks and go throw Charlie Brown off a cliff, keep in mind that he's the best friend that science fiction ever had, who's not a writer. And, it's like, if you pull his full membership, it's not going to solve all the problems of the organization. But nobody wanted to listen to me. So eventually they got it, as a question that the membership voted on. And the membership voted it down solidly. No requalification at all. They were, it should have been dead. And then 6 months later, it was back. And I couldn't believe it, And someone had resurrected it, saying that as it was worded on the ballot, it was, people didn't really understand what they were voting down. And I said, no, they got it, man. But they were trying to resurrect it again. And eventually it seems to have gone away. At least I hope it has. We have since had many other kinds of things going on with that was like the least of our problems. It's like the most recent big deal, that I can remember is what happened with Requires Hate. And that wasn't really a Sephwa thing, that was kind of a online life thing.
That was what now?
Requires Hate. Do you remember the Mixon report that came out a few years ago? Look it up. Look it up. Because if I recount this for you, it won't really do it justice. But the Mixon report was something that Laura Mixon put together after doing a great deal of research. And she did it. She's an engineer, and she did it scientifically. And when it came out, it was very eye-opening for a lot of people. There were people who had been persecuted online.
What was she reporting on exactly?
This is a big event and all I can do is just urge you to, Google it, look it up. It was a person who, one of her pseudonyms was Requires Hate, was stalking and badgering and threatening people online to the point where, it's like they were too scared to go online anymore. Some people, some of them stopped writing. She's actually she's a science fiction writer in Thailand. Her first name is Binyanun. I can't pronounce her last name, so I'm not going to try. But
Binyanun Shriduankal?
Binyanun.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. That's the name. I'll let you mispronounce it. I don't.
I'm sure I did a pretty bad job.
Yes. Well, she had a few friends, and together they kind of had a reign of terror over a lot of people. And
so they were ahead of their time.
Oh, well, I don't know if they were really ahead of their time. Cyberbullying was already very much a thing. And, it's like when you have someone react like that to your book, and they can find you online, it's kind of scary. Bless you, darling. My husband's sneezing. He's allergic to persecution.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. So,
now I looked this up. When you first mentioned it, I thought maybe this was something that happened some time ago, but this was just in the 2012, 2014.
Actually, it was. I believe it came out in 2014, but she had been doing this for something like 10 years prior to that. I'm not sure if it was as long as 10 years, but it was a good long time before enough people found out about it. And I was among my group of friends. Some people were kind of being bullied. And one of the things that happened was originally this person denied being Requires Hate. She denied that she was the person behind it. And it was a lie. And she had told other people that she was. And there was an occasion where someone was just, I think this happened on Twitter, where one writer had implied that she was Requires Hate, and another writer was just ripping her up one side and down the other for being such a racist, for thinking that, any Thai writer was Requires Hate. And the first writer, party of the first part, called me up and said, I am quitting this stupid field. I don't want to be in this anymore. And she told me what was happening. And I went on Twitter, and I got really kind of mom. And I said, I know the names of the people who know the truth. And if they don't come forward in 24 hours, I'm going to reveal those names and ask them why they haven't. And some of the people didn't know what was going on. And they were able to enlighten the party of the second part. And the woman who was the person who was ripping my friend up one side and down the other was not a bad person. She was a very good person, and she was trying to defend someone that she thought was being wronged. And Requires Hate had allowed this to happen, and that was one thing that made me very angry, that she let people go to war with each other over a lie. It's like, what are we? Richard Nixon, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, and she had a great deal of, she had a lot of sympathizers. And anyway, the truth came out in the Nixon report. And it made big news here and there around the net. And do you remember Milos?
Yiannopoulos, I think.
Yeah, him.
Yeah.
One day he got online and he tweeted, "I don't think a cogent report of the the Requires Hate affair has ever really been written. Watch this space. I'm going to run myself." And I tweeted back at him saying, if a cogent report had never been written, you wouldn't even know about it. And I left a link for the Mixon report. Now, I thought twice before I did this, because I was wondering if maybe I wasn't going to bring the entire wrath of Gamergate down on myself. And then I thought, well, fuck it. Sorry, can I say that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. At that time, it was like February, and I just had my I think I had my second round of chemo by then, and I was still under the impression that they thought I only had till the end of 2016. And so I thought, well, the hell with it. What are they going to do? Tweet me to death? And they tried, but it wasn't Gamergate. It was, they claimed that I was trying to bring the wrath of Gamergate down on poor little Requires Hate. And I was trying to expose her to being stalked and threatened and doxxed by them. And her friends got together a Twitter mob, and tried to scare me. It's like when they all pile on.
Yeah.
But the thing is like, you can't bully someone who isn't afraid of you. And so they'd say something, I'd say liar, because it would be lies. And it was over by the end of the day. Because, it's like, okay, terminal cancer, tweet mob, please.
I guess that this kind of stuff had been percolating all along, because essentially Requires Hate is a troll. And in 2016, when some of this was kind of hot and heavy, we elected a troll president of the United States.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
If you know what to look for. But you only see it in hindsight, I guess. I couldn't believe that after Barack Obama, we actually could have elected Donald Trump. And I am still a U.S. citizen at this point, and I have voted in every single presidential election that I have been eligible to vote for, to vote in. And my mother and I voted for Obama from here. She was still alive. And she passed away a few months after he was elected a second time. And my mother said, maybe this means that we're really going somewhere else now. We're being enlightened, that we would elect a black man. And one of the things she said was, I'm not sure, maybe we ought to only elect black people to higher office. And this wasn't the sort of thing that my mother would say. It's like she was neither politically correct nor politically incorrect, but she was pretty smart. And I said, well, why is that, Mom? And she said, well, Barack Obama, I can tell that he's so educated. He's so well-spoken. He's so confident. She said, but I have a feeling that if I met him on the street and he asked me about my life and I told him about it, he would understand it.
That's what a lot of people think about Trump, though. That's one of the secrets to Trump's success, is that so many of the people who follow him think that he gets them.
Well, what he gets is the moments when, you're so frustrated, you just can't think, and you say something stupid, or you do something stupid, or you feel like the whole world's against you. And he played on that, and really ground away on that. And I got to tell you, I was really shocked in January, January 6th, when that happened in Washington, when the mobs, burst into the Capitol building and went hunting Mike Pence with a noose. And I thought, in all the times, all the protests I've seen, and I've been in a few. I was in Washington, D.C. on May Day in 1971 for the anti-war protests, and I got beat up by a cop. And then they wouldn't arrest me because I had a head injury. But I got beat up by the cops. I've seen people, demonstrating prior to that, the civil rights demonstrations, people getting fire hosed and beaten and all the stuff, and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and everything. But none of those were ever things where I ever saw government people fearing for their lives. Nobody in the government was afraid in 1971 that we were going to storm the Capitol building and try and drag people out and lynch them. And for all the criticism of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, at no time did anyone in government have to feel afraid for their lives. At no time did most people have to fear, coming to any harm. There were windows broken here and there and property damage, but nobody was ever so afraid as, I've seen the film, the videos, the clips of, people, the legislators running through the Capitol building, and the demonstrators, I'd hesitate to call them demonstrators, the
insurrectionists.
The insurrectionists are, practically on their heels. And they're supposed I read this thing that a cop had given in an interview saying he thought when they were beating on him because they thought that when they got to the police and told them why they were there, the police would immediately drop their billy clubs and shields, join hands with them, and storm the Capitol too. And they were really shocked when that didn't happen.
It's a lot of magical thinking going on there.
Yeah.
Well, I remember from, when Obama was first elected, the great hope everyone had. And it was similar to what happened when I remember the Kennedys, or Kennedy, replacing Eisenhower and Nixon. And we had that great hope, and that went away, of course. And then when Carter replaced Nixon and Ford, we were again, enlightened, and we thought that it was going to be a new age, and the other forces came back with a great vengeance, and that's what I see happened with the transition from Obama to who shall not be named. That's one of the words we won't say.
Yeah.
You could say all those other good ones, but I try to avoid he who shall not be named.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad my mother wasn't allowed to see that, because it would have killed her. She never did like him anyway, even when he was, just sort of kind of a figure of fun or buffoon. And I have a feeling that now everyone knows America has always prided itself on, this is the country where anyone can grow up and become president. Well, now anybody did. And now maybe they should put a few maybe qualifications into that. You have to have some experience in government if you want to become president.
Well,
because as someone said to me, electing him president is like getting on a plane and the pilot comes in and the pilot thinks planes are stupid and has never taken a flying lesson.
Well, speaking of buffoons, how is Boris handling the absence of his former good buddy in office?
Oh, Boris! I've been working on this novelization, and it's taken a very long time to put to bed. And I've been working like around the clock sometimes. So I missed Boris's statement about how he'd rather see bodies piled high than go back into lockdown. And my first thought was, okay, darers go first, Boris. You know, I can't believe that anyone would say that. Okay, maybe some of the people who stormed the Capitol, but you know. But I can't believe that anyone would say something like that.
It's a very strange time. It really is.
Yeah.
And I don't know quite what to make of it, but since you mentioned it, I do want to bring up the novelization that you're working on, which seems very interesting to me that you're doing a novelization of a screenplay that was written by William Gibson.
Yeah, that is very interesting. The first thing I did after I got the screenplay was I got hold of the Dark Horse comic novelization, Dark Horse comic adaptation, and it was very different from the script that I had. And I found out later that it was adapted from, you know, the second version that Bill did. This was the one I got as the original, and Bill Gibson did an introduction to the Dark Horse comic, which he explained how it came about. And the studio approached him and asked him, I guess they gave him a treatment and asked him to write a script. And so he did. And in the Dark Horse comic, he says that they were, as it turned out, they were expecting Neuromancer with aliens, I guess. You know, they're expecting cyberpunk style, but they weren't going to produce the script. They were going to give it to another writer so that he could rip off Bill's style and produce a script. But Bill was a big Aliens fan, you know, it's like many of us were. So he produced, you know, an Aliens script. And I guess they didn't like the first version, so they asked him to do another one, and he did another one. And then he said, they said, thank you, that will be all. And that was the end of his participation and also his connection. He saw no money from the Dark Horse adaptation. He's no longer, it isn't his property. He doesn't get a cut of anything. It belongs to the studio. The studio does with it as they please. And that's what happened.
So was it a work for hire arrangement that he had with them?
I guess so. I guess it was.
That's interesting.
I don't know exactly how these sorts of things work. Every time someone tells me a story about Hollywood, you know, and doing scripts for studios or something, I think to myself that they probably can't pay me enough to work in Hollywood. Because it sounds a lot to me like working for Hallmark Cards without the big paycheck. And Melinda Snodgrass has described working in Hollywood this way. She said, you put your tit in a wringer and they turn the crank while they hand you $100 bills until you scream for them to stop.
Yeah, I think Gibson had a lot of that, right? He's written several unproduced screenplays, so I've heard.
Well, you know, I don't keep up. But
of course, they did Johnny Mnemonic, and it really wasn't a very great film.
No, they did it before they had people who understood cyberpunk. They were just all, oh look, shiny chrome. Oh look, you know, high tech low life. We can put a lot of women in high heels and scanty clothing, but it's mainly men. So anyway, Bill's favorite character, of course, was Ripley, but they told him that they didn't want Ripley in the story.
Interesting.
So, yeah, they did not want to continue Ripley's story
because ultimately in the thing that got produced, Ripley was there.
Yep, and she continued to be there, you know, for the next couple of movies. She was. Anyway, but they didn't want her in it, And so he turned to his second favorite character, Bishop. And it was okay to have Bishop. Now, Newt is in the script briefly, but they didn't really want her in the story either. So, so both of them exit. They're not on stage for very long, and they are both, they both leave or are sent away. And it actually is a very, very good script. But it's also a script of its time. At this point, it's almost 30 years old. So one of the things I had to update, besides making the cast more diverse, was to update the technology, because most of it had been overtaken by the time I got the script. So I told my editor that I was going to do that, and my editor was cool with that. And at this point, the studio has seen the script. They had like 3 queries about what I did. And they were confused by a couple of things. So I fixed it so that nobody had to be confused. I didn't fight with them or anything. I generally don't do that, I figure that if it doesn't come off to someone who's reading it, it's my fault, not theirs.
You're very tactful.
I am very tactful. But, it's like, hey, we're all under a lot of pressure to be productive. So, I try to be easy to work with. And but this was a long. I did like 5 or 6 drafts of it before I turned it into my editor, and not because I just I'm very meticulous, but also because it was Bill's script. And
I know you've done. Oh, I'm sorry. I know you've done novelizations before.
Oh yeah.
And to that point of it being Bill's script, to what extent, when you're doing a novelization, do you use like dialogue from the script, and to what extent do you create your own?
I do a lot of creating my own, simply because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And since you don't have a picture, you have to, the reader can't just look at the screen and see the setting. You have to tell them where they are. Now, in novelizations, the people who read them will have seen the movie or will have seen stills from the movie. Usually they've seen the movie beforehand, so they know what the movie looks like. But I take pains with the setting as given in the script. Now, most novelizations, my own included, will not follow the movie exactly. And it's not because we deviated from the script. We're not allowed to deviate in plot or characterization. And if we add dialogue, it has to be in context, in character. It can't be, something out of left field. It's because there's such a long lead time for books, and we get the script while the movie's being filmed. And during filming, they change things. They change lots of things. They change all kinds of things. And then, the script comes out and someone will say, well, the novelization drifted from the script. And I'll say, no, it didn't. It didn't drift. The movie drifted from the script. Things change while they were filming. They discovered that something didn't work on film, and yet it does work, in print. It's okay in print. There are other things that don't work in print that you do have in film. So it's not always going to be, absolutely what you see on the screen and what you read in the book aren't going to be identical.
But in this case, you're writing, the movie's already come out, but you're really writing a novelization of a different version of the script. So it's going to be pretty different from the movie, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Bill was under the impression that he was writing Aliens 3. And we know what Aliens 3 looked like. Well, there is nothing of Aliens 3 that was the movie that was released in Bill's script. Bill's script is sui generis. It's of its own. It's a sequel to the previous movie, Aliens with the Colonial Marines. And gosh, the first novelization I ever did wasn't for Titan. It was for Black Library. I think they were called Black Library then. I did a novelization of a movie called Cellular with Kim Basinger. And I remember I was working along, novelizing. I was prosifying the script. You know, it's the first step is turning the script into prose. And if at straight prose, it would be like a novella, you know. But I was 100 pages into the novelization, and they sent me a new script, and I had to scrap everything and go back to the beginning. But, you know, it's like that's what I signed up for, and I knew that it was a possibility. I had a ball doing that. And I also did Jason X, Friday the 13th, 500 years from now, and an original media tie-in novel that went with it for the same publisher.
I bet that was fun.
I had a ball doing that. The movie was already out, and I got a copy of the DVD, and I watched the movie, and I watched the movie along with reading the script. And where the script and the movie diverged, I went with the movie because that's, you know, and the only way it diverged was like in the order of a few scenes. But the studio wanted a certain number of words and no less. And it was quite a few. They wanted 95,000 words, no less than that. And a movie script is not really given to, I mean, unless you're doing something that's deliberately 6 and 7 hours long. But I had to put in an awful lot in Jason X to meet the word limit. And
well, it makes sense because when you film a novel, you have to take a lot of stuff out, right? You have to simplify things and remove characters and so forth.
Yeah. So I sneaked in stuff about Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil and all kinds of stuff I put in. And I developed backstories for all the characters that, you know, have nothing to do with the movie and aren't in the movie at all. And Melinda Snodgrass once again told me that one of our friends read the book. He picked up the book and read it because Jason X, Friday the 13th, and Pat Cadigan sounded like very strange bedfellows to him. So he read the book and he said, gee, this must be a really good movie. So he went out and bought the DVD and found out that what he really liked was all the stuff that I'd put in. And I've never been prouder of that. You know, I'm very proud that I made the movie something that he wanted to see. But the movie itself was a hoot. It really was. The people had a sense of humor about everything. And it wasn't, there was a certain amount of have sex and die, but, you know, it was not heavily gory, slashery, awful. And,
I have to have a copy of that book.
You know, it's expensive. Even I can't afford a secondhand copy. You know, I think it's on Amazon at like 50 quid.
I think I saw one of your books listed for like $800 on Amazon.
Yeah. And I remember there was one book that was listed at an outrageous price, and I let everybody know because it was a book that was still in print. I said, you don't have to pay that much for that book. And it was not a collector's edition, you know, it was just the regular edition. I said, don't pay that. I'll give you the book.
I think that book that was $800 that you could buy the Kindle for $1.99.
Yeah.
They're having one of those specials right now.
Yeah. That sounds about right.
Yeah, a lot of those people selling on Amazon, they're sketchy at best.
I think they may be optimistic, certainly. But yeah, some of my the artifact, the book itself will sell for a certain amount of money. But I hopped aboard Gateway, the ebook thing that Golanx developed. Malcolm Edwards was so smart. He could see ebooks in the future, and he went around buying up everybody's backlist, everyone who would consent, and he bought my backlist, and he put it into electronic print, and he took my career off life support and reinvigorated it and rejuvenated it, and suddenly I had a real career again, instead of people coming up to me and saying, I can never find any of your books. Where are your books? And I'd say, well, you're going to have to crawl through a secondhand bookstore on your hands and knees, probably, to find a copy. And,
I have one of your books right behind me here, Dirty Works.
I see that. I see it's looking right at me, too.
Yeah.
I have to follow you around the room. Yeah. That was an edition that my former husband Arnie Fenner did with Mark Ziesing, and it's one of my favorite editions, because Arnie is such a good designer. He was such a good designer of books. He had done a number of other books, not just mine, with Mark Ziesing. And they're all beautiful editions, and that is a beautiful edition of that book.
We've kind of run out of time. We were going to go for an hour, and we're just over an hour right now.
I'm sorry.
But no, don't be sorry. In fact, we could go on for hours, and because we're at a kind of cliffhanger here, I mean, I'm thinking of all kinds of other questions I could ask, so it'd be great if you could come back, in a couple of months and do another.
I will come back anytime you want me to.
Well, thanks so much.
Well, thank you for asking, and I'll be glad to come back anytime.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.